The forest was silent, almost too silent. Ethan had been walking for hours, his boots sinking into the soft alien soil. The twin moons hung low in the sky, casting silver light between the black, twisted trees. He was far from the human colony, too far for anyone to hear him if he called for help. But he wasn't worried about himself. He was just trying to find a faster way back before the cold night got worse. Then the sound came. It was faint, at first a single cry. High-pitched, sharp, and filled with fear. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was a voice. Someone was in trouble. Ethan froze, his breath clouding in the cold air. He looked around, the sound of the cry echoing through the trees. Another cry followed. This time, it was clearer. It was a girl's voice. Ethan moved without thinking. His steps were fast, his eyes scanning the dark shapes around him. He pushed through thick bushes, ignoring the sharp branches scratching at his arms. His heart was pounding. He didn't know who she was. He didn't even know if it was a trap, but he couldn't just walk away. The cry stopped. Ethan slowed, listening. Then he saw the glow. It came from a small clearing up ahead. Torchlight's shadows moved between the flickers of orange flame. He crept closer, staying low until the scene came into view. In the middle of the clearing, tied to a tree, was a young alien girl. Her skin was pale silver under the moonlight, her hair long and black, falling across her face. She was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. Around her stood at least 10 figures tall, alien hunters dressed in rough armor made from bone and metal. Their faces were hidden behind masks, carved to look like snarling beasts, and they all held bows. Ethan's eyes widened when he saw the arrows. Long black shafts with razor-sharp tips, aimed directly at the girl's chest. One of the hunters shouted something in a language Ethan couldn't understand. The others laughed. The girl closed her eyes, tears falling silently. Ethan felt something. Inside him snapped before he knew it. His legs were moving. He ran into the clearing, his boots pounding against the dirt. The hunters turned in surprise, but they were too slow to react. Ethan threw himself in front of the girl, his arms spread wide. The first arrow hit him in the side. The pain was white-hot, stealing his breath. He staggered, but didn't fall. Another arrow struck his shoulder, spinning him half around. He could hear the girl gasp behind him. The hunters were shouting now, confused and angry. But Ethan didn't move from his spot. He stood tall, shielding her with his body, his teeth clenched against the pain. One of the hunters drew his bow again. No. The girl's voice broke the silence. Something in her tone made the hunters hesitate. They looked at each other, muttering. Then, without warning, they lowered their weapons and melted back into the shadows of the forest. Ethan collapsed to his knees, blood running warm down his side. His vision swam, the world tilting. He felt a soft hand touch his back. You? Why? The girl's voice was shaky, almost unbelieving. Ethan tried to smile. Couldn't. Just watch. Then the darkness took him. When he woke, the air was warm. A dim orange glow lit the space around him. He was lying on a bed made from woven leaves, a blanket of strange soft fur covering him. The smell of herbs filled the air. The alien girl sat nearby, her large, luminous eyes watching him carefully. Her hands were wrapped around a bowl, steam curling from it. She looked small, fragile, but there was a quiet strength in the way she sat. "You are awake," she said softly. Her voice was musical, but cautious. Ethan groaned as he tried to sit up. "Where am I?" "Safe, for now." She glanced at the door, as if listening for something. Ethan's gaze fell on the bandages wrapped around his chest and shoulder. They glowed faintly. The pain dulled. "You did this." She nodded. "You should not have helped me. They will hunt you now." Titha frowned. Why were they going to kill you? Her eyes dropped to the floor. Because I am cursed. That is what they say. Ethan didn't believe in curses. Well, he said slowly, they'll have to go through me first. The girl looked at him, something unreadable in her expression, outside, far in the distance. The sound of a horn echoed through the forest. Her eyes widened. They have found us. Ethan pushed himself up, ignoring the pain. Then, we'd better move. And just like that, they were no longer strangers. They were two people with one choice: run or die together. The night was colder now. The air sharp against their faces as Ethan and the alien girl moved quickly through the dark forest. Ethan's steps were uneven every time he put weight on his injured side. Pain shot through his body like fire. But he didn't slow down. The girl stayed just ahead of him, her bare feet silent on the mossy ground. She moved like she knew every twist and shadow of the forest, pausing only to glance back at him. Her eyes kept scanning the darkness, her pointed ears twitching at distant sounds. Behind them, faint and far, the horns sounded again. They are still following, she said softly. Ethan's breath came hard. Then, we keep going. The girl stopped suddenly. You cannot outrun them like this. She looked at the blood soaking through his glowing bandages. You will fall before the night is over. Ethan gave a weak grin. I've had worse. But he hadn't. She studied him for a moment, her face unreadable, then turned sharply to the right. Come, I will take you somewhere they will not find you. They left the main path, pushing through thick undergrowth. Branches clawed at Ethan's jacket, but the girl moved effortlessly. Soon, the forest grew denser, the moonlight fading behind layers of leaves. The ground dipped, leading into a hidden hollow surrounded by huge rock walls. There, the far end, was a small structure half buried in the earth, covered in vines so thick it almost disappeared into the landscape. She hurried to it, pulling aside the vines to reveal a narrow door made of old wood. This is my shelter, she whispered. It is small, but safe. Ethan ducked inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was no larger than a human bedroom, but it was warm. A low fire burned in a small pit, and the walls were lined with woven mats. He sank down onto a pile of soft furs, his body giving up the fight. The girl moved around the room quickly. She poured water into a small pot over the fire, dropped in some dried leaves and roots, and let them steam. The smell filled the air, sharp but comforting. What's your name? Ethan asked after a moment. She hesitated, then said, Lyra. Lyra, he repeated, testing the sound. I'm Ethan. She nodded once, but didn't look at him. You should not have come for me. Those hunters, they kill for sport. You have marked yourself now. Ethan winced as she knelt beside him and checked his bandages. Guess I've made worse enemies. Her fingers were gentle but quick. They think I bring misfortune. My family. They gave me to them as an offering. Her voice was low, but there was no anger in it, just a tired sadness. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not misfortune. That's cruelty. For a moment, Lyra's eyes softened, but then she pulled back, placing the steaming cup in his hands. Drink. It will make the pain less. The liquid was bitter, but warm as it slid down his throat. Almost instantly, the burning in his shoulder dulled. His heartbeat steadied. How far will they go to find you? He asked. Lyra's gaze shifted to the door. Farther than you think. The hunters do not stop. Then I'm not stopping. Either, Ethan said firmly. She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to understand why a human would risk his life for someone he had just met. Finally, she said, You will rest here tonight. Tomorrow, I will guide you away from there. Lend. He shook his head. No. Tomorrow, We get both of us out. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting shadows across the small shelter. Ethan drifted in and out of sleep, the warmth of the furs and the medicine pulling him down. Once, he woke to see Lyra sitting, cross-legged by the door, her eyes sharp and ears twitching at every sound outside. At some point, he realized she hadn't slept at all. "You don't trust me?" he murmured. She didn't look back. "I trust you more than anyone, but not the night." Just before dawn, a noise came from outside, a faint crunch of leaves. Lyra's head snapped up. She moved to Ethan's side, whispering urgently, "They are close?" He struggled to sit, his muscles stiff. "How do you know?" "A tea? I can hear their steps and smell the smoke from their torches." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Then we go. Now." Lyra grabbed a small leather satchel from the wall and slung it over her shoulder. "Follow me. Stay quiet." They slipped out through a back exit Ethan hadn't noticed before, a narrow tunnel leading out of the hollow. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with mist. As they climbed up the slope, Ethan glanced back. In the pale morning light, shapes were moving near the shelter. Tall, masked figures. The hunters had found the place. Lyra's pace quickened. They know the shelter. They will not stop now. Ethan adjusted his grip on the satchel she handed him. "Then let's make sure they never catch us." The forest stretched ahead, endless and unknown. But Ethan knew one thing: he wasn't leaving her behind. Not now. Not ever. The mist clung to the forest floor like a living thing, curling around Ethan's legs as he followed Lyra deeper into the trees. His breath was already heavy, each step sending a dull throb of pain through his wounded side. The medicine from last night dulled it, but exhaustion was creeping in. Lyra moved ahead of him, light on her feet, her silver skin almost blending with the early morning fog. Every few steps, she would stop, tilt her head slightly, and listen. Ethan could see the way her sharp ears twitched, catching sounds he couldn't hear. "They are close," she whispered without looking back. Ethan's eyes swept the shadows. "How close?" She glanced over her shoulder, her voice low but urgent. "Close enough that we cannot stop again." He gritted his teeth and kept moving. They wove through towering trees with roots that rose from the earth like twisted walls. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and strange flowers that glowed faintly in the dim light. Somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic sound echoed drums. Ethan slowed for half a second. "Is that their hunt rhythm?" Lyra said grimly. They beat the drums to tell each other where to drive their prey. And right now, "We're the prey," Ethan muttered. Lyra didn't answer, just motioned for him to follow her down a narrow path between jagged rocks. The forest seemed alive with movement. Every now and then, Ethan thought he saw shapes between the trees, tall, lean figures slipping silently through the fog. The sound of arrows sliding against bowstrings carried faintly on the wind. "They're hurting us," Ethan realized. Forcing us in a direction they want. Lyra must have realized the same, because she suddenly veered sharply left, off the path entirely. They pushed through a wall of hanging vines and stumbled into a hidden hollow surrounded by thick undergrowth. "We go this way," she said. "They will not expect it." Ethan eyed the dense plants ahead. "Looks like they won't be the only ones surprised." She gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Trust me." They moved quickly but quietly. The only sounds the soft crunch of leaves and the distant steady beat of the drums. Then thwip. An arrow slammed into the tree trunk inches from Ethan's head. He spun, spotting two hunters emerging from the mist, bows raised. Lyra's hand shot out, grabbing his sleeve. "Run." They sprinted through the undergrowth, arrows hissing past them. One grazed Ethan's arm, another sliced through Lyra's hair. She ducked low, weaving between trees with quick, sharp movements, forcing the hunters to aim poorly. Ethan, slower and heavier, had to rely on instinct, dodge, and pray none of the black-tipped arrows found his heart. They broke into a clearing, their boots sinking into damp moss. Lyra didn't stop. She darted toward a fallen log that stretched across a shallow stream, leaping onto it with the grace of someone who had done it 100 times. Ethan followed, nearly slipping on the slick wood. Below, the water gurgled softly, dark and cold. Halfway across, Lyra froze. Down, she hissed. Ethan dropped instantly as an arrow tore through the air where his head had been a moment ago. Another thudded into the log beside him. Lyra pulled a small curved blade from her satchel and sliced through a hanging vine overhead. It dropped into the water below, its thick leaves splashing down. For a moment, it broke the hunter's line of sight. They ran the rest of the way across, on the other side. The trees grew darker and closer together, branches forming a tangled ceiling that blocked out the light. The air was cooler here, the ground soft and uneven. "This is the hollow path," Lyra said between breaths. "It is dangerous, but less dangerous than them." Ethan didn't have to ask what them meant. He could still hear the hunters. Voices somewhere behind them, speaking in sharp, clipped tones. The hollow path lived up to its name, dipped and curved, forming deep trenches in the earth where strange, pale plants grew. At one point, they had to slide down a slope so steep that Ethan's boots nearly lost traction at the bottom. A dark pool stretched across their way. The water was perfectly still, almost too still. Lyra stepped in without hesitation, wading quickly through. "Keep moving. Do not stop in the water." Ethan followed, the cold biting at his legs. "Why?" "Because it is not just water," she replied without turning. He didn't ask again. By the time they climbed out on the far side, Ethan's muscles were trembling from effort. Lyra knelt briefly to check the bandages on his side, her touch quick and efficient. "You are slowing," she said. "I'm still moving, aren't I?" He replied with a small smirk. Her lips twitched, almost into a smile, but then her expression hardened. "We must reach the high cliffs before nightfall. If we do, they cannot follow us easily." "High cliffs," Ethan repeated. "And what happens if we don't?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Then we will not see another dawn." They set off again, but the hunters were getting closer. The sound of their footsteps was no longer distant, was just beyond the trees, accompanied by the whisper of arrows being drawn. Ethan's body was running on pure stubbornness now, but his mind stayed sharp. He counted the sounds, the distance, the angles. The next time Lyra glanced back, he said, "They're pushing us toward something, maybe an ambush ahead." She nodded grimly. "Then we must be the ones to surprise them." Her eyes scanned the terrain ahead until she spotted a narrow ridge of rock rising above the forest floor. Without warning, she turned and led him toward it, climbing quickly despite the loose stones. When they reached the top, Ethan could see the hunters below, 6 of them, their masks gleaming in the pale light, moving like wolves through the mist. Lyra's voice was low, but fierce. "We do not run from here. We make them regret coming this far." Ethan met her gaze, then tightened his grip on a fallen branch he'd picked up earlier. "Then, let's make it count." The ridge was narrow, just wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. Below, the forest stretched endlessly, a sea of green mist hiding the hunters' movements. Ethan crouched low, his breathing heavy, his wounds aching. But his grip on the fallen branch never loosened. Lyra was crouched beside him, her silver eyes fixed on the moving shadows below. The hunters were spreading out, their bone masks turning. Slowly as they scanned the ridge, "They will try to surround us," she whispered. Ethan glanced behind them. The ridge curved sharply, and far in the distance he saw a tan-old rope bridge stretched between two cliffs. The wooden planks looked worn, some broken, swaying gently in the wind. Beyond it was another ridge, steeper and rockier, and beyond that, a sheer drop into clouds. "That's our way out?" he asked. Lyra nodded once. "It leads to the high cliffs. If we reach them, they cannot follow without losing many." Ethan gave a humorless smile. "Then we'd better make it before we lose ourselves." They moved quickly, but quietly, sticking close to the cliff's edge. The wind grew stronger. The closer they got to the bridge, tugging at Ethan's jacket. His boots crunched softly on loose gravel, each sound seeming far too loud in the stillness. Halfway there, a sound cut through the wind whip. An arrow slammed into the rock inches. From Lyra's face, sparks flying. She flinched but didn't stop, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him forward. The hunters had seen them. More arrows came, whistling through the air. Ethan ducked behind a boulder, feeling one pass so close it brushed his hair. Lyra crouched beside him, her breathing steady despite the danger. "They're trying to drive us faster," she said. "They want us to rush onto the bridge." Ethan peered over the rock, scanning the hunters' positions. "And if we do, they'll cut the ropes behind us." She didn't deny it. "Then we cross on our terms," Ethan said firmly. They burst from cover, running hard for the bridge. Arrows rained down, some embedding in the ground, others snapping against the rocks. Ethan could feel the air shift each time one passed close. When they reached the start of the bridge, Lyra hesitated. The wooden planks creaked loudly under her. First step, swaying dangerously. Ethan glanced back. 3 hunters were closing in fast, bows ready. "Go," he shouted. Lyra sprinted across, her light frame barely making the bridge sway. Ethan followed, his heavier steps causing the planks to groan under his weight. Below, the gorge stretched down into darkness, the wind rising from it cold and sharp. Halfway across, a sharp snap echoed. One of the planks beneath Ethan's foot gave way, and his leg dropped through the gap. He caught himself on the ropes, gritting his teeth as pain shot up his side. Lyra spun, her eyes wide. "Ethan, I'm fine," he gasped, hauling himself back onto the bridge. "Keep moving." But as they neared the far side, Lyra stopped abruptly at the other end of the bridge. 3 more hunters waited, bows drawn. They were trapped. Ethan's mind raced. Behind them, the first group of hunters was already stepping onto the bridge. Ahead, the second group had perfect aim. Then his gaze dropped to the ropes. "Lyra," he said quietly, "when I tell you, jump to the cliff edge and don't look back." Her brow furrowed. "What are you?" "Just do it," he cut in. "Trust me." The hunters ahead shouted something in their language. One raised his bow. "Now," Ethan roared. Lyra leaped, her hands grabbing the rocky ledge of the far cliff. At the same instant, Ethan drew the knife from his belt and slashed at the bridge's left support rope. The tension snapped violently, the entire bridge tilting sideways. The hunters behind screamed as the planks beneath them twisted, sending them tumbling into the gorge. Ethan's grip on the remaining rope was slipping, but he forced himself to cut the second rope before the front hunters could react. The whole bridge collapsed, taking him with it. Lyra's scream echoed through the gorge. She reached out desperately, her fingers brushing his sleeve before he fell out of reach. The wind roared in Ethan's ears as he plummeted, the shattered planks tumbling with him. Then, with a bone-jarring splash, he hit the icy river far below. For a long moment, everything was chaos water dragging him down, the cold stealing his breath, the current pulling him through jagged rocks. He fought to surface, gasping when he finally broke through. The river carried him away from the bridge, away from the hunters. He let it take him, too weak to fight. The last thing he remembered was the sound of rushing water and the faint echo of Lyra's voice calling his name. When Ethan's eyes opened again, the world was dim and quiet. He was lying on damp sand beside the river, every muscle aching. Above him, the cliff walls rose impossibly high, the bridge far out of sight. Somehow, he was alive. He pushed himself up, coughing up river water, and scanned the banks. No hunters. No Lyra. Just endless forest stretching on either side. He didn't know if she had made it to safety, but he intended to find out, and if the hunters were still after her. They'd learn just how far a human would go for someone he refused to lose. The river had carried Ethan far, but it had also taken most of his strength. By the time he staggered to his feet, his legs were trembling, and the cold had sunk deep into his bones. Every step felt like a battle. Still, his mind stayed on one thing: finding Lyra. The forest here was quieter than before. The mist was thinner, the trees spaced farther apart, their tall trunks stretching toward the pale morning sun. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the soft rush of another stream. He followed the sound, hoping it would lead him somewhere safe. After what felt like hours, he spotted movement ahead, a flash of silver hair. His heart jumped. Lyra. The figure turned sharply, and relief flooded Ethan's chest. It was her. She was standing on a mossy bank, unharmed, though her clothes were damped from the river's spray. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "You're alive," she said, almost disbelieving. "Wouldn't miss the chance to keep you out of trouble." Ethan replied with a tired grin, but Lyra's expression quickly grew serious. She motioned for him to follow. "We cannot stay here. Kumai will take you somewhere they will not dare follow." They walked for hours through winding forest paths until the ground began to rise sharply. Eventually, the trees parted to reveal a massive rock wall covered in hanging vines. In its center was a narrow opening, half hidden by shadows. Lyra stepped forward and whispered something in her language. To Ethan's surprise, the vines slowly shifted aside, revealing a hidden passage. "Welcome to the hollow refuge," she said softly. The passage led into a vast canyon hidden deep within the cliffs. Warm sunlight spilled across fields of alien plants, their leaves shimmering in shades of blue and gold. Houses made of stone and carved wood were built into the rock, walls connected by narrow bridges and winding stairs. Ethan stared in disbelief. This is a whole village. How do the hunters not know about this place? "They know," Lyra said quietly. "They fear it. Many who come here never return." That wasn't exactly comforting. As they entered, villagers stopped to watch. They were all alien like Lyra, but their clothing was made of finer fabrics, and many wore small metal charms around their necks. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to suspicions, especially when their eyes fell on Ethan. An older woman approached, her silver hair braided and her posture tall and commanding. "Lyra," she said in a low, stern tone, "you bring a human into our sanctuary." "He saved my life," Lyra replied firmly. The woman's sharp gaze shifted to Ethan. "Few humans come here. Fewer leave." Ethan met her eyes without flinching. "Then maybe I'll be the first who does both." They were led to a central hall built into the cliffside. Inside, the air was warm from a central fire pit. Symbols were carved into the stone. Walls circles within circles, surrounded by lines like arrows pointing inward. Lyra explained that this was the Hall of the Protectors, a place of decision for the village leaders. Ethan sat quietly as the elders debated in their language, glancing at him now and then. Finally, the old woman addressed him directly. "Lyra tells us you stood before the hunters and took their arrows. She says you did so without knowing who she was." "That's right," Ethan said. "And yet, you bear the mark." Ethan frowned. "The mark?" She pointed to his shoulder where one of the arrow wounds had been. Around the bandaged skin was a faint, glowing pattern, a circle of light, pulsing slowly. This mark, the elder continued, is the sign of the scarred protector. An old prophecy says one will come from beyond the stars, bear the hunters' wounds, and defend our cursed child. Ethan glanced at Lyra, who looked just as startled as he felt. "Let me guess," he said slowly. "You're the cursed child." Lyra looked away. "That is why my own people gave me to the hunters." The elder stepped closer. "If the prophecy is true, then your fate is tied to hers. But know this, if you remain here, the hunters will come. They will not fear the sanctuary for long." Ethan thought about the bridge, the arrows, the chase through the forest. Then maybe it's time someone gave them a reason to stay afraid. Some of the elders murmured in agreement, but others looked uneasy. The old woman finally nodded. "Rest tonight. At dawn, we will decide." Ali led him to a small dwelling, carved into the rock. The inside was simpler bed of woven reeds, a small fire pit, and shelves lined with jars of dried herbs. "You shouldn't have agreed to stay," she said quietly once they were alone. "If they attack here, it will be because of me." Ethan sat down on the bed, meeting her gaze. "Lyra, I didn't risk my life twice just to hand you back over. If they come, we face them together." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment before turning away. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. Somewhere outside, the sound of distant drums echoed faintly through the cliffs. The hunters were coming, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the real fight hadn't even started yet. Dawn in the hollow refuge was quiet to quiet. The usual soft hum of villagers preparing food, the sound of footsteps across the bridges, even the chatter of children was missing. Instead, there was only the steady wind that whistled through the canyon walls. Ethan stood at the cliff's edge, scanning the horizon. The rising sun painted the clouds gold, but it didn't hide the movement below. The hunters were coming. From this height, he could see them, dark shapes moving through the forest far beneath the cliffs. Dozens of them, their bone masks glinting faintly in the light. At their center marched a figure taller than the rest, carrying a long black bow carved with glowing red runes. They brought their chief, Lyra said quietly as she joined him. She wore simple leather armor now, a short spear in her hand. He is the one who decides who lives and who dies. Ethan's grip tightened on the makeshift shield strapped to his arm, around slab of metal he'd found in the village armory. "Then we make sure he regrets coming here." By mid-morning, the villagers were ready. The elders had ordered every able-bodied fighter to the walls and bridges, bows and spears in hand. Hidden pits had been dug along the narrow paths, weighted. Nets hung from the cliffs, and jars of burning oil stood ready to be tipped. Ethan moved through the defenses, checking every position. When they try to cross the first bridge, drop the nets behind them. "Trap as many as possible," he told one group of warriors. "And you?" He pointed to another. "Don't aim for the chief yet. Make them waste arrows first." Some of the villagers looked uncertain, but Lyra stood close, repeating his orders in their language. Her voice carried authority, and that seemed to settle them. Finally, they reached the outer wall, a series of stone barricades built into the narrowest point of the canyon entrance. This would be where the first clash happened. By midday, the hunters had arrived. Their drums echoed up the canyon, a deep, steady rhythm meant to rattle nerves. Ethan felt his heart pick up pace, but his mind stayed sharp. The chief stepped forward, raising his black bow. His voice carried up to them in a challenge Ethan couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. "They are calling for us to hand me over," Lyra said, her expression hard. Ethan's answer was simple: "Not happening." The attack began with a storm of arrows. They hissed through the air, clattering against the stone walls. Ethan crouched low, raising his shield to block those aimed at him. The villagers behind the barricades loosed their own arrows in reply, forcing the hunters to take cover. "Hold," Ethan called, waiting for the hunters to commit, when the first wave of masked warriors charged the bridge. Ethan gave the signal. Nets dropped behind them, cutting off retreat. Spears rained down from above, and the bridge became a tangle of bodies. The chief didn't slow. He strode forward, loosing black-fletched arrows that pierced shields like paper. One struck a villager beside Ethan, knocking them back. "Cover me," Ethan shouted, then leaped over the barricade. He charged forward, shield raised, slamming into the nearest hunter and sending him sprawling. Another came at him from the side, blade flashing, but Ethan ducked low and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. Lyra fought beside him, her spear a blur. She moved with deadly precision, blocking strikes meant for Ethan and cutting down anyone who got too close. But even together, they couldn't stop them all. The hunters pushed forward, their numbers overwhelming. Ethan found himself forced back, toward the inner bridge, the last barrier before the heart of the village. As they crossed, the chief took position on the opposite ridge. He raised his bow slowly, his gaze fixed not on Ethan, but on Lyra. Ethan saw it in that split second, the way the chief drew the string back until it trembled. The way the arrow's tip glowed faintly with lethal energy. "No," Ethan breathed. Without thinking, he threw himself in front of her. The arrow struck his chest with the force of a hammer, driving him to his knees. Pain exploded through him, sharper than any wound before. His vision blurred, but he stayed upright, planting his shield into the ground like a wall. Lyra caught him as he started to fall. "Ethan," he coughed, forcing a grim smile. Still, not done. The sight of him taking the arrow seemed to ignite something in the villagers. A roar rose from the walls as they surged forward, driving the hunters back. Oil jars were tipped, flames leaping high and forcing the enemy to retreat toward the canyon's mouth. The chief fired again, but this time the arrow shattered against the stone as Ethan, still kneeling, raised his shield in time. By the time the sun dipped low, the hunters were gone, dragging their wounded and leaving their dead behind. The canyon was quiet again, except for the crackle of burning oil and the low murmur of the villagers tending to their own injured. Ethan sat against the barricade, his chest wrapped in fresh glowing bandages. The pain was still there, but he was alive. Lyra knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You could have died," she said, her voice low but fierce. He met her gaze. "And you'd be gone if I hadn't." For a moment, they just looked at each other, the noise of the village fading away. The battle was over. But Ethan knew the fight for her safety wasn't finished yet. The battle was over. But the hollow refuge still carried the smell of smoke and scorched wood. Ash drifted in the cool evening air, carried away by the wind that swept down from the cliffs. The villagers moved quietly, now repairing damaged bridges, tending to the wounded, gathering their dead with silent reverence. Ethan sat on the edge of a low stone wall, his chest and shoulder bound tightly in fresh glowing bandages. Each breath was a reminder of the arrow wounds, the bruises, and the exhaustion that had settled into every part of his body. But when he looked toward Lyra, standing near the central fire, he knew it had all been worth it. She was speaking too. The elders, her voice steady, her eyes bright not with fear, but with resolve. The Lyra he had met in the forest, tied to a tree and trembling, was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced her hunters, fought beside her people, and survived. When she finished, she walked toward him, her steps slow but certain. She stopped just in front of where he sat and tilted her head slightly. "You should be resting." "I'll rest when I'm sure they won't come back tonight," Ethan replied. "They won't," she said simply. "Not after today. You shamed them. You made the chief bleed. They will take time to recover." He gave her a faint smile. "Guess that's one for the prophecy then, huh?" Lyra's gaze softened. "Prophecy or not, you did what no one else ever did. You stayed." That night, the village held a gathering around the largest fire pit. The elders called it a circle of gratitude, a tradition for honoring those who had defended their people. The firelight cast long shadows as the villagers formed a wide ring, each person holding a small, glowing stone. One by one, they stepped forward, placing their stones at Ethan's feet until they formed a circle of soft light around him. An elder stepped forward. "Ethan of the stars," she said, "you came to us a stranger. You took the arrows meant for our own. You fought when you could have fled. For that, you are not only welcome here, you are one of us." The words hung in the air, carried on the crackle of the fire. Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He had never fought for recognition. He had fought because walking away from Lyra had never been an option. When the circle broke, Lyra found him again, leading him away from the firelight toward the quiet edges of the village. They walked in silence until they reached the cliff's edge, where the moonlight painted the canyon silver. "This is where I used to stand," she said softly. "When I thought there was no way out, I would look at the cliffs and wonder how far I would get if I tried to run. But no matter where I went, the hunters always found me." Ethan glanced at her. "They won't anymore." She turned to face him fully. "Not because they fear me, because they fear you." "That's not the kind of reputation I was aiming for," he said with a small smirk. Her lips curved faintly, but her eyes were serious. "You gave me more than protection, Ethan. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again, freedom. And I want to give you something in return." He raised an eyebrow. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why it matters." She stepped closer, close enough that the glow from the bandages lit her silver skin. "The elders offered you a place here as a warrior, as a protector. But I want you to stay for more than that." Ethan searched her face, reading the meaning behind her words. "You mean, with you?" Lyra nodded once. "As my partner, my equal, my choice." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rushing through the canyon. Ethan thought about everything: the forest, the bridge, the arrows, the prophecy. Every scar he carried now was tied to her. And somehow, the weight of them felt lighter in this moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that's the best offer I've ever had." Her smile was small, but real. By morning, the decision was made. Ethan stayed. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding, repairing the outer defenses, strengthening the bridges, and teaching the villagers some of the tactics he had used during the battle. Lyra was never far from his side, and together they walked openly through the village that had once feared her. The hunters did not return. Perhaps it was the memory of the man who stood in front of their arrows, or perhaps it was something deeper. Realization that this cursed child was no longer alone. One evening, weeks later, Ethan stood again on the same cliff where they had spoken under the moonlight. Lyra joined him, slipping her hand into his without a word. They watched the sun sink behind the distant mountains, the light catching on the river far below, the same river that had carried him away from death. "You still think it was worth it?" she asked suddenly. Ethan glanced at her, his smile slow and certain. "Every scar I have tells a story, the best ones." He squeezed her hand gently. "Are the ones I got saving you?" Lyra didn't answer with words. She simply leaned against him, the wind carrying the scent of the wildflowers that grew along the cliffs. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt at peace, and in that quiet, under the fading light, he knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning.